Joining the show is author, survivalist Jim Wesley Rawles. He has been a guest on this show once before. He is an author and blogger. He edits the website survivalblog.com, and he has authored his latest book is Survivors, a novel of the coming collapse. Jim, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Peter.
All right, so how do you see this coming collapse unravel, and do you think this Occupy Wall Street movement, it could be the beginning of these types of events unraveling here?
Yeah, I think you may be right. I think that the average American needs to be feeling a lot more pain before we see mass riots in the streets, but it could happen. You know, as I'm sure you know, there's a big divergence of opinion whether we're going to see a deflationary collapse or a hyperinflationary collapse. I'm in the inflation camp personally, and I think once inflation really kicks in, especially with all the monetizing that's going on right now with quantitative easing, there's going to be a lot of pain. There's going to be a lot of people that literally won't be able to afford to eat because their paychecks are not going to gallop as fast as consumer price inflation. That could lead to riots, and Lord knows, it all depends on whether or not the power grid stays up. If the grid stays up, I think we may see a pretty lengthy depression. If the grid goes down, all bets are off.
Well, ultimately, I think the grid is going to go down because of lack of power, because as the dollar collapses, our ability to generate power is going to be greatly diminished. We're not going to be able to import all these resources from around the world, and many of our own resources are going to be exported to people who have stronger currencies. And the fact is now these Occupy Wall Street protesters, I read earlier today, one of their goals is they want all debt to be forgiven. They want the government to forgive all student loans, mortgage debt, credit card debt, second loans, everything, which is basically what inflation is going to bring about, only through a different pathway, because they don't seem to understand. If you wipe out all the debt, you also wipe out all the assets. All the banks are gone. All the insurance companies are bankrupt. The pension funds are bankrupt. I mean, you wipe out all this wealth when you wipe out the debt. But the problem is the debt is so large it can't be paid, so that wealth is going to get wiped out, whether the government forgives it or not, because it's going to get wiped out with a printing press.
I think you're right, Peter. I think it is a fait accompli at this point.
Yeah, and so what do you do? So what are in your book? What is the advice that you're giving? I mean, what should Americans be doing right now to prepare for this? And of course, usually when people give out this advice, I mean, the media looks at us looks at you like you're a kook, because you're preparing for what they believe to be as likely as an alien invasion.
Well, I've moved my family to a very lightly populated rural region west of the Rockies. We've got national forests surrounding our property, and we're pretty well hunkered down. We have a great, huge woodshed full of firewood. We have a large garden. We hunt, we fish, and most of our neighbors are in a similar mode. So I think that's probably the safest way to live. Of course, not everybody can do that. Even somebody that is living in the suburbs and feels stuck can at least lay in a good year or two supply of food with storage food and get themselves a good quality water filter so they can filter water from the runoff from their roof, from their downspouts.
Yeah, I've advocated that.
Simple things that people can do that will greatly increase their chances of survival.
Yeah, I've advocated that, but I've said even if you don't need the food from a survival standpoint, it's still a pretty good investment, because if you're simply buying products that you would have bought anyway a year or two from now, and if a year or two from now the prices are 10 or 20% higher, well, that's the same thing as buying a stock and making a 20% profit. In fact, it's better because you don't have any capital gains. You don't have to pay any taxes on the gains because you don't really have any gain. You just eat the food. And if it goes up in value between the time you buy it and the time you eat it, the IRS hasn't figured out how to tax us for that yet.
Yeah, there's a couple of more advantages. One is, of course, by buying in bulk, the unit price for each ounce of food you're buying is much lower.
Absolutely.
That's an advantage. And it's not just disaster insurance, it's also layoff insurance. If the family has a 1 or 2 year food supply squared away, if the head of the household gets laid off, at least that's one part of the budget you don't have to worry about during the time you're laid off.
Yeah, you got your food covered. So definitely it makes sense to cover the bases. So for a lot of people, though, the only problem might be they just don't have that much extra storage room, especially if they're living in a city and they're living in a small apartment. You barely have room to store, a week or two's worth of groceries, let alone a couple of years.
Yeah, although I've shown some things in my blog on how people can get creative with storage space in terms of, you can raise your whole bed by 16 inches and make a platform under your bed consisting of 5-gallon food-grade plastic buckets full of food. And that doesn't increase the footprint of your bed at all. It just raises it a bit and throw a dust ruffle around it, and then nobody even knows it's there. But you're sitting.
That's true. That's assuming that people aren't already using the area under their bed to store some of their other belongings. They might have, their tennis racket, their skis, or some of these, studio and 1-bedroom apartments are pretty small. Even the 2 bedrooms. But yeah, I mean, there are, they have these, these little doohickeys, or I forget what they are, where you can really expand your closet space. I mean, so people might have to try to make do with the small area that they have. Some people could probably rent a small storage facility. Sometimes in some of these apartment buildings, you can rent some extra storage space in the basement. So that'd be a solution for some people.
Yeah, I do recommend, though, that if people are self-employed or retiring or near retirement age, that they consider making a move to the boonies now. 2 or 3 years from now may be too late.
Well, is there a lot of real estate available out in the boonies? Is it, or do you have to build the place?
It's fallen nationwide, including rural areas, and especially, surprisingly, in resort areas. But from a survival standpoint, I don't really recommend resort areas. For example, if someone in California wanted to move to Lake Tahoe, well, yeah, prices have come down 40% for houses at the lake, but if you showed up at your house or cabin in Lake Tahoe right as things were falling apart, who else is going to be showing up? All your neighbors from the big city who are going to bring nothing with them. So you may actually be in a worse situation. You may end up in a situation where all your neighbors have is guns and no food. That's a bad situation.
Yep. But, what about, for the people, though, who are, you're saying, retired people, elderly people, what about, hospitals or, things like that? I mean, they need to be close enough to medical attention. I mean, what's that like out in the boonies?
Well, there's, if you move to, say, 30 or 40 miles out of Salt Lake City or 30 or 40 miles out of Spokane, Washington in the Northwest, there's, still fairly major medical centers available. And you're not that far out, and you're not even all that far out from shopping. But what you've done is put yourself in a more lightly populated, food-producing area with plentiful water. That's the crucial thing, is water and food. It's going to come down to that.
Yeah, although are they going to be able to protect that food? If you're elderly, you might not be able to, even if you've got, say, some kind of weapon, I mean, you might be easier to be overpowered. There might not be as much police protection out there in the boondocks if some of the people find out that, hey, there's people up there with food. But anyway, it's a very tough future to contemplate, but we will continue discussing it when we get back here on the Peter Schiff Show at schiffradio.com. Welcome back. This is Peter Schiff on the air with Jim Wesley Rawles, talking survival and his latest book, Survivors, a novel of the coming collapse. Hey, Jim, first of all, why do you have a comma in your name, separating Wesley from Rawles? What's up with that?
It's more of an affectation. It's a common law distinction to show the distinction between my given name, which is my property, and the family's name, which is common property.
Yeah, you lost me there.
Well, just chalk it up as a affectation, like the British hyphenated.
So should my name should be Peter David, Schiff?
Well, yeah, since you share that name with Irwin Schiff, for example, right? That's your name is Peter, his name is Irwin, but you're both Schiff. So it is a common law distinction, and it's one that's fairly arcane, but I like to point it out to people.
All right. So every time when you sign your name or on your credit card, do you have the comma in your credit card when you look down, or your driver's license?
It's on most of my legal documents, but it definitely throws some of the bureaucrats for a loop.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so I want to talk about your latest book, which I guess is a novel. So it's not really a how-to survivor's guide. You're actually writing a fictitious account of what might happen during a collapse, correct?
Right, but it is more or less a survival manual dressed as fiction. In all of my books, I try to squeeze a lot of tactical, practical stuff into a fictional storyline. So there's a lot.
So who are the main characters? When is it supposed to take place?
It's set in the near future. It's set in the exact same time frame as my first novel, Patriots. It's actually contemporaneous. And the main character is a young Army officer just being released from active duty in Afghanistan, and everything falls apart. All the commercial flights and the military flights get grounded because simultaneously there's some terrorism going on. He has to make his way all the way from Afghanistan back to his home in New Mexico in the midst of a global socioeconomic collapse. It's quite a
why doesn't he go someplace else? It's like, why doesn't he just go head to New Zealand or someplace? I guess he's got family members, yeah.
So it's basically, the novel is a vehicle to talk a lot about different tactics and techniques and technologies for family survival, family preparedness. So everything from firearms to communications, first aid equipment, you name it. It's all there in detail. And it's essentially designed to get people thinking and get people motivated to actually prepare. Not just be armchair commandos, but actually train and prepare and stock up.
Yeah. I think something is going to happen that is going to certainly have it make sense for people to have been prepared. I hope it doesn't get to the point where it's a very violent, dangerous situation to live in the United States. But, if we continue on our current path, that's unfortunately going to be what's going to happen, because people are going to react to their circumstances. And if they're unemployed, if they can't afford food, if there's no power because they can't afford energy, or if there's, all kinds of rationing going on, and people like these kids that are protesting on Wall Street, they're going to be blaming somebody and looking to find somebody, to go after, someone to attack. Just like Michael Moore, I played his sound. They want to see heads roll. They want people going to jail, and if they don't go to jail, maybe people will take justice into their own hands.
That very well could happen. And one other thing to consider is that when we had the Depression of the 1930s, still 20% of the population was living on farms and ranches. Mm-hmm. And now we've got 1% of the population feeding the other 99%. So even if we had a depression on the same scale as the 1930s depression, I think we're going to see a lot more violence because there's going to be a lot more people starving. People don't have...
Oh, yeah, we don't have... everybody is dependent on other people to provide the necessities. We have a very specialized economy now, and there's an old saying that specialization breeds extinction. And, part of the problem, too, I just was talking about is the psychology and the mentality of the mob, because you can get a bunch of clear-thinking, clear-headed, law-abiding citizens and put them together in a group, and all of a sudden rationality can go out the window, and people can act in ways that they never would have thought they would have acted under normal circumstances, and justify violence against people that they feel are somehow responsible for the conditions that they're in.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. A few years ago, I was in Reno, Nevada, at a Walmart store, and there was a power failure because a large power transformer just down the street blew out. And you should have seen the panic. People were throwing bags of Huggies in their shopping carts and heading for the door. And this was, in a suburban,
Well, that's just a lot of, people might take advantage of an opportunity to steal if they think they can get away with it. But, what I think is going to happen this time is not just people trying to get something for nothing, but people really acting out their frustrations on society or the members of society, whether it's going to be the rich. I mean, people who are living in Manhattan. I mean, you have some of the wealthiest people in America within very close proximity of some of the poorest people in America, and it is obviously going to be a dangerous place to be, when it hits the fan. And and if the governments, of course, if the governments are all broke, the question is, will they be able to afford to provide the type of protection that we're going to need in a climate like that?
I don't think they will. I often like to say that FEMA should actually stand for foolishly expecting meaningful aid. The government is not going to be available or capable to provide any kind of disaster relief if we have a nationwide, long-term collapse situation. They can't even handle a short-term, localized situation.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a disaster that is not the same as a hurricane or a flood that impacts a particular region. If we're talking about an economic collapse, we're talking about the entire nation being a disaster area. And, of course, the government can't see what the way that FEMA works is you take money from one part of the country and give it to the part of the country that has the disaster. But if the whole country is simultaneously suffering the same disaster, where is the money going to come from?
That's a great question, Peter. As you and I both know, we live in a very fragile, complex society. The chains of supply are thousands of miles long, and we've adopted the Japanese-style Kanban inventory system. So there's no longer a back room at your local grocery store.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for coming on the show again. Let's at least hope in this time around that fiction is much stranger than reality, and your book doesn't end up being a prophecy and more of just a sci-fi fantasy. But anyway, be prepared just in case. Anyway, everybody else, we will be back. We have another half hour coming up here.